I just chose. That is Sledgehammer. Wow. Okay. This is why we don't like Pandora. Just look. Not prepared anymore. Okay. We're here. Not prepared anymore.
Sometimes you get Sledgehammer.
Sometimes, I don't know. Hi.
We're live. We did it.
We made it here.
We made it here. We were trying for She Blinded Me with Science, but we got Sledgehammer. You know, sometimes things are different than we expect. So welcome.
Baby stole my Spotify. Sorry.
Welcome to Suicide and Stuff. We will start out really quick with our rating. Des, do you want to put the rating up there?
Rating.
Oh yeah, we're rated R for language, terror, and some disturbing images. So make sure if you're under 17 that you have a parent or guardian or something, or sneak around effectively enough to watch this live, which I'm sure we've all been able to accomplish. So I am very excited. We have David Klonsky here today. We'll do some quick introductions and then dive in. I am Jess Stohlmann-Rainey. I use she and her pronouns, and I work in Denver, Colorado in the crisis system. And then I also do quite a bit of work kind of on the national level, mostly like rabble-rousing around lived experience and social justice and suicide. Coming with all my opinions to all of the right spaces, hopefully, maybe. Des, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Dese'Rae Stage. I run Live Through This, which is a series of portraits and true stories of suicide attempt survivors across the U.S. I'm also an MSW student, and I do lots of varied other things. Lots of them.
All right. And David, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm excited that I can curse on this. I've never been on like a live stream or podcast before that explicitly had an R rating.
Yeah, so definitely as much as you want it.
But hi, I'm David Klonsky, a psychology professor at University of British Columbia, and been researching suicide for about 10 to 15 years now, and happy to be on here. I'm looking forward to conversations.
Awesome. So tell us about why in your career path, why did you choose to study suicide, or what makes you interested in suicide or suicidology?
Sure. I mean, in some ways it was because I was very interested in non-suicidal self-injury for the longest time. I think just from the standpoint that, like a lot of adolescents and students growing up, you get interested in psychology because you have struggles in your own life and you have questions about, social stuff, and other people seem to fit in, and how do they understand what the social rules are, and things like that. So I was, interested in psychology in general. I think I was especially interested in personality at first, again, like a lot of folks are. But while this was happening, I got interested in non-suicidal self-injury, in part just because on the surface, it's a counterintuitive behavior. We spend a lot of time in our lives trying to avoid pain, avoid injury, and yet there's a subset of folks who injure on purpose and obviously get something out of it. And when I started asking some questions to various, whether it was instructors or practicum supervisors early in grad school, this is going back to 1999, 2000. I would get very unsatisfying answers. So I'd ask things like, well, DSM says it's a symptom of borderline personality disorder, but there's people without BPD that also self-injure. How often is that? And the answer I would get is, well, it's a good question. I don't really know. And I would ask, well, how many people self-injure who don't necessarily have, meet criteria for diagnosis? They just kind of self-injure and go about their day. And I don't know. It's a very interesting question. So I think I got interested in that in part for all the same reasons I was interested in clinical psychology. Like, why are we the way we are? And what's up with all the, the social stuff and the emotional stuff that doesn't always go right. But there is also something about self-injury that's undeniably real. A lot of times when you're dealing with personality or personality disorders, you're dealing with constructs or things that have definitions that may or may not be accurate. And the way we classify personality and personality disorders has historically had a ton of problems. And so there's always a sense of where you're trying to understand something better, but it's hard to know if you're even studying the right things. And self-injury, it's real. It's undeniably real. It's concrete. And it was something that was very poorly understood back then. And I think the field's made a ton of progress since. You can't really start asking questions about self-injury without getting into suicide and what's the difference. And of course, that has a whole history too. People conflating self-injury as suicide and sending the emergency room for self-injury, things like that. And I mean, I feel like sometimes I wish I had a better answer, but the truth is what really got me into the field of suicide is when American Foundation for Suicide Prevention gave me a small grant when I was just starting out as a young investigator. And it made me feel like, wow, like somebody cares about my thoughts and they care about what I'm doing. And interestingly, at the time, it was a project focused on the fact that 18 million things in a data set correlated with suicidal ideation, feeling suicidal, but those same 18 things were not higher in people who had attempted suicide. So I think that also stuck out to me as we're missing a big part of the picture here. Something's not quite right. That was a data set also where measures of impulsivity were not higher in people who attempted suicide, people who had suicidal thoughts and didn't. And that was really counter to the clinical wisdom of the time and highly cited papers. So I think it was more of a sense of there's something undeniably real and important. And yet, when you start asking questions, even the most basic questions don't seem to have the right answers. And I think it was the combination of those things that got me into it, combined with AFSP saying, "Go for it, David. We like what you're doing."
Oh, I think it's so interesting in the field in general. There's people will present about or talk about kind of things they think of as highly correlated with suicide with so much confidence. And often we're missing tons of information. I think there's way more that we don't know about suicide than that we do know. And we tend to focus on sort of recreating and reproducing all of the same knowledge over and over again. So I'm interested in like kind of your thoughts on that, because it sounds like you were uncovering some of those things pretty early on in your career, and that's what made you interested to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a way where you can be pessimistic and you wouldn't be completely inaccurate. And you can say for the last 40 or 50 years in the field, we've been spinning our wheels on the research end of things, kind of doing the same kinds of studies over and over, finding the same kind of correlates over and over, but not really understanding the story of suicide any better. At the same time, I think that that's not entirely true. Science isn't often that you do one or two studies and then you sort of make big leaps in discovery. Usually it's, there's hundreds of studies, thousands of studies, and they're each a puzzle piece. And at various points in time, you can start trying to assemble the pieces. You can look at everything that's ever been done that you have access to and start trying to make sense of what do we know and what do we not know. And science is supposed to be cumulative. So the fact that we've covered a lot of the same ground isn't necessarily wrong either, to get away from the pessimistic view. So I do feel like I was very fortunate that when I came into the field, it was sort of the right time to have a bird's eye view for someone who was an outsider to the field, because I didn't go to a graduate lab that studied suicide. So when I started studying suicide, it was really on my own and just brought a natural outsider's perspective. I also think I got lucky that it was the right time to come in, look at everything that's been done, having no preconceived notions about what I'm supposed to believe, and seeing some key questions that were well answered, but other questions that were completely not well answered, and then other misconceptions that people really believe strongly that seem to not be supported by the evidence. So I mean, by the standard of helping people who are in need and giving people the care they need, now we're pretty terrible. By the standard of most human endeavors, and looking at how long it takes us to accumulate knowledge about something, I'd say we're behind schedule, but we're not as behind as we sometimes are.
Yeah, I think I guess it's hard to decide which measurement you're going to use. So I guess when you're in the science side, probably using the science measurement makes more sense. But from my perspective, it feels like things are slow and clunky, and sometimes we cling to things and really hard that seem to not be
I think the field is worse than some other fields. I do think that we're clinging to certain perspectives in the field longer, like that are clearly contradicted by the science, but yet we're clinging to them longer than we should. Like it's a lot about the way the medical model approaches suicide is just flat out contradicted by the science. A lot of the way we intervene, flat out contradicted by the science. But to oversimplify, and it is, it's hard to not oversimplify on a podcast or live stream. Psychiatry is mainly in charge of both how suicide risk is treated in hospitals and treatment facilities, and also in what the funding agencies decide to fund. And the average of psychiatry is wrong about a lot of things. And it's really holding up the field and causing problems with research and messing with people's lives in ways that aren't right.
Yeah. People being willing to say disparaging things about psychiatry is one of my favorite things. Thanks for coming here for that.
I got a lot more for you if you want.
I have a lot. Yeah. So you have a theory of the 3-step theory. Let's talk about that. We can come back to psychiatry because I'm sure we will. Talk about your theory.
Sure. Theories are tough. Any theory for it to be useful has to do two very opposite things. It has to be simple enough to be like understandable and accurate and applicable, and yet it has to be broad or complex enough to account for tremendous individual variation. So right from the get-go, having a theory about something is very challenging. It has to sort of somehow do those two things right. There are a lot of things that do that. It sounds impossible when you phrase it that way. If something's complex, simple theory's out the window. And I just think that's flat out not true. Behavioral theory is a great example. It doesn't solve everything, but it sure helps a lot to understand basic principles of reinforcement and punishment and habituation. There are things in the field of mental health that we've gotten better at helping people with, even if we're further behind on suicide risk. But if you subject like the behavioral theory to the same kinds of questions that we often subject suicide theory to, it makes it seem like it's ridiculous. What is reinforcing? Like, well, lots of things are reinforcing. Like, kind of anything the organism finds positive. But what's the full list? You need to specify the list. And you know what? You're actually wrong, because something can be reinforcing for one person and not reinforcing for another person. So your theory is wrong. Or what's reinforcing in one culture is not reinforcing in another culture, so your theory is wrong. And that's not true. Behavioral theory is extremely useful and extremely accurate across a variety of contexts and people and cultures. And at the same time, it can accommodate the kind of complexity that I'm alluding to. It manages to be specific and broad at the same time. And that's what a suicide theory needs to aim for. I didn't come up with a suicide theory on purpose. I really was very happy doing very descriptive exploratory work, because that's what felt to me like the state of the field was. Didn't feel mature enough for when I got in it to be developing theories with any kind of confidence. It felt like so many basic questions are not answered. Like, when people feel suicidal, what do they feel? What about after they feel suicidal? What's the difference between times when people feel suicidal and don't make a suicide attempt versus when they feel suicidal and do make a suicide attempt? What the hell's up with impulsivity, because it doesn't operate the way everyone says it should? Like, there are so many basic questions. I was very happy to just do descriptive work. Oh, what are the motivations for suicide? Every theory specifies different motivations, and no one had taken the time to come up with a measure that would meet minimum standards of reliability and validity, but then actually assess different motivations that theories say are important. To find out, are some more common than others? Are the motivations that are most common in certain groups less common in other groups? Just very basic descriptive exploratory work. Very happy doing that. And then one day I heard about a distant family member, something that was going on with their life, and someone who had struggled for a while, and I got very concerned about their suicide risk. And I had to answer the question for myself, why am I concerned about their suicide risk? Because this person had been struggling in various ways for a while. What's different now? And as I started to think it through, I realized I accidentally had come up with a theory of suicide. I did have principles that I was following to determine when suicidal feelings occur, when they're most likely to stay more moderate, when they're most likely to become very strong, when they're most likely to translate to action. And I just fired off an email to Alexis May, who was my grad student at the time. She's now a psychology professor at Wesleyan. And that email is 90% of what the theory ended up becoming. So that was a lot of words that didn't even answer your question about what the theory is.
Okay, go. You got to tell us what it is, though.
Yeah, tell us what the theory is now. We're ready.
The problem is that theories already suffer from being simple. And then when you got to explain them in a few words, they get even more simple, and everything sounds ridiculous when you simplify.
Two
but
sentences.
Fine. First step of the theory addresses when suicidal desire develops. The basic idea is that if someone's in pain, that's what creates the desire that I don't want this anymore. This is a deep instinct we're all born with. Even a young child touches a hot stove, they learn very quickly to not touch that hot stove again. And so that's just as biologically and evolutionarily wired into us as fear of death. But if someone's experience of being alive is painful, is aversive, is miserable, then that same instinct kicks in. I don't want this anymore. If the person though is also hopeful that things will get better with time, if I change something, if I do something, then your focus stays on just, you can sit with the pain easier, you can get to a better place. But if you become hopeless that there's any way to escape the pain, then you start feeling maybe being alive isn't for me, and suicide becomes more of an option. That said, it's not just about what pushes us away from sort of our desire to be here and to be alive. There's also things that can pull us towards life and want us to keep us here. And that's where step 2 of the theory comes in, which we call connectedness in a very, very broad way. Connectedness can be to other people, and it can be belongingness, like in Joiner's theory. But really, it's connection to any sense of purpose or meaning. Pets can be included. TV shows we enjoy can be included. Things that keep us coming back to life. And if someone's connectedness is sort of greater than their pain, then life is worth it, even though pain doesn't stop, even though they're hopeless about the pain going away. And that's when suicidal desire kind of, it's often in the background. One often thinks, sometimes I wonder if I'd be better off dead. But it doesn't become something that someone's thinking, maybe this really is the right choice. Now, obviously, all these things have ebbs and flows. Pain has ebbs and flows. Hopelessness does. Connectedness does. So it's not like once you are marked on these variables that you're fixed. I mean, where you are now could be different from where you are in an hour, in a day, in a week. And so these things, these proportions ebb and flow. The thing with connectedness is for some people, it might be low to begin with, and the pain doesn't make it worth it. Or when pain gets great enough, it can sort of take away our ability to enjoy things we're usually connected to. Just like if we're getting over a day or two of food poisoning and we're just miserable and we're just surviving, you cannot enjoy your friends or loved ones on that day, and you can't look forward to things. You're just getting by. But what if 3 days later you're still suffering from it? What if a week later you're still suffering from it? You eventually lose hope it's going to go away. And pain can be great enough that it removes your ability to appreciate connection. So step 2 can sort of work in either way. The key is whether pain is exceeding or overwhelming connectedness. And if it is, it's not just that you sometimes wonder if you'd be better off dead, but this instinct, I don't want this anymore. Life is painful, aversive, miserable, starts to get more powerful about how can I get out of here? How can I end this? And then the third step is for people who are at that spot, strong suicidal desire, pain is overwhelming. They can't, hopeless to get a way out. It's dwarfing their sense of connectedness to things that matter to them. The question becomes, can you act on it? And suicide attempts are hard. They're difficult. For some people, they might be scary. For some people, you're not sure how to do it. I think for a lot of people, the act itself is scary. I think one of the places that earlier theory may have gone just a tiny bit wrong was fearlessness about death got a lot of emphasis. But I think it might be more fearlessness of making the attempt that might be more important. But there's other kinds of things too. Even just knowing how to do it, so to speak, having confidence that you have a method that will quote unquote work. There's a whole universe of capability variables that we're just starting to understand, but that would allow some people, but not other people, to act on strong suicidal desire. Boom, that's the best I got.
I
You
think
did
that was
it.
a really good description of the theory. So, and obviously everything is more complex than we're going to explain in a podcast. There's lots of different versions of ideation to action kinds of theories. And there's a lot of similarities in some of them and some differences. So I'm just curious about how you see your theory being different than the other ones that are kind of trace that ideation to action spectrum.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's a few differences. I mean, Rory O'Connor has a theory in this category where he focuses on defeat and entrapment as causing motivation for suicide. And I was thinking about it and I thought, gosh, feeling defeated and like you're entrapped, that sounds a lot like pain and hopelessness. Are we saying the same thing? And, I don't know if you had a chance to interact with Rory, but he's just a really great person, easy to talk to, very accessible, very outgoing. And so we were having lunch and I asked him about that. And he said, no, that's not what I'm saying. So I said, all right, go back and read your theory again. So I agree that it's useful to understand the ways in which the theories overlap and don't. And it sounds like not everyone will have the same perspective on that. I think there's no question that in putting this perspective forward, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, to borrow that phrase. Pain was emphasized by Schneiman back in the day, hopelessness by Beck and elaborated by Abramson, connectedness by Durkheim and Joyner. The structure of the theory, I mean, it's not identical to Joyner's, but the fact that it's explaining desire and then action separately, obviously that's standing on Joyner's shoulders. So to the extent the theory is useful, and it's because I've benefited so much from so many people who've put out ideas beforehand. When we talk about psychiatry, bad words can come up.
That's my sister, so she has to rabble around as well.
One difference is that I start with pain, which some people really expect a theory to be like really specific, like Bernson's belongingness. That's the kind of aversive experience. That's the kind of pain. I think that's just not right. I think for some people, those things aren't that painful to not be socially connected to people. There's loners in the world who could be quite happy. There's lots of other reasons to be in pain. And I just think it's, asking what causes the pain that's relevant is kind of like asking what kind of stimulus is like a punishment for someone from a behavioral theory perspective. Is it electric shock? Is it loud noise? Is it social exclusion? And the answer is all of it. Anything that's aversive. And I think that's where suicidal desire starts too. If life is aversive and miserable and the pain's overwhelming, that's where that instinct kicks in. I don't want this anymore. And someone might have trouble wanting to continue to engage with life. And that's going to be different for different people. So it's both a great place to start because it is much more specific than perspectives out there, especially diagnostic ones. Start with the diagnosis. That's not useful. It's a great place to start, and yet it's something that's going to have very different stories for different people, where their pain comes from, what for them is painful, what their pain's about. So that's one difference. Another difference is that the essential role of connectedness is in creating wish to live. As Joyner's theory is more when connectedness goes wrong, it creates wish to die. That can happen. Like the three-step theory doesn't say that's impossible because connectedness issues can be painful, but the theory doesn't require that. What the theory does require, though, is that connectedness, the essential role is that if you maintain connectedness to things in life that matter to you, it's protective against suicidal desire becoming strong. And I think it's fair to say that most people who have suicidal thoughts or feelings or whatever we want to call it, they spend probably most of their time at lower levels or occasionally feeling like sometimes I wonder if I'd be better off dead, as opposed to every day, every minute, I would kill myself if I could. And so I think that's part of what the theory accommodates, is why that is. And then at the capability end, it basically says Joyner had the right idea, and all credit to him because that's a big advance. But capability is much broader than just acquired capability or fearlessness about death. And I suspect it's, the three-step theory talks about some temperamental kinds of or dispositional contributors to capability, and I think those are real, and there's some evidence for that. But I suspect practical capability is kind of the undiscovered country. Like we all know it makes sense, but we really haven't done a lot of formal work unpacking what that means, how to talk about it in risk assessment settings or treatment settings. So those are some ways that the theory is different from what came before it.
Got some more Stohlmann goodness.
Oh, that's really reinforcing.
Yeah.
Psychiatry's bad.
Okay.
I'm interested in, like, so outside of your own work, are there other things in suicidology that you're super excited about right now? Like things that people are doing that you think are really cool or interesting, or like there's some new stuff happening that you're really excited to hear and learn more about?
Well, people will think that you did this on purpose, or I did it on purpose, but Live Through This is one of my favorite projects in the field.
Thank you.
And yeah, I want to use the word stigma, but there was that Twitter thread recently about why that word doesn't work. So what's a synonym for stigma I can use just for now?
Discrimination.
Discrimination. There is, I feel like it's more than discrimination. I feel like when there's discrimination that's tends to be based on race or things like that, there's a lot more elements of like overt power over people or even hatred. Mm-hmm. And that happens too, but I feel like with suicide, there's also like people are like scared and squeamish. Like it's not, I feel like it does come from a somewhat different place. So I don't know. I certainly see why stigma is too soft a term. It's sort of like, it puts kind of blames the phenomenon as opposed to that people aren't reacting to it in a reasonable, empathic way. But I also feel like it's somehow different than, I don't know, for another time perhaps.
I think lots of people were interested in sort of that differentiation today. Was that today on Twitter?
Or was that today or yesterday? No, it was today too. Anna and Bart and Seth went back and forth for a while.
Realizing that these things happen and that they don't automatically make someone like fragile and childlike. And that comes into play in so many ways. I don't know if you guys are fans or not of Ronda Rousey, who got famous in the mixed martial arts world, but she also has been, she's worked really hard for suicide prevention and I think given a lot of money to D.D. Hirsch, for better or worse. I mean, some of the money could be useful here, but anyway. But one thing that happened is when she talked about, while she was still active in her career, she talked about having suicidal feelings. There was all this, I think it was well-meaning reactions from MMA fans that she needs to retire immediately. She can't handle this. And it's like people didn't understand that people can have these kinds of thoughts maybe often or even regularly, but still be completely well-rounded functional human beings. And I think some of it is genuine. I think there's good people who struggle with this in addition to people who need their empathy dials turned up. When a friend of mine in the martial art, I didn't know him that well, but basically a young friend turned out to have a psychotic break, for lack of a better term. And so he was brought to the hospital by people who didn't know what was happening, and I ended up joining him there. It was kind of late at night. And I talked to the psychiatric nurse, and it was just a wonderful conversation. I feel like we understood each other. We were talking about the same things. We both weren't sure what was happening, but we were trying to make sure that he was safe. There was some issues about, I don't want to get into details, but like some things being said about possible environments not being safe, and it was hard to know whether that was real or whether that was coming out as part of what was happening. And it was really all about like just trying to be as helpful as possible. And then we waited for 1 or 2 hours, and the psychiatrist shows up, and oh my God, it was just horrible. It was just horrible. He treated this guy like he was a child. He started asking me questions in front of him that were really personal, and he didn't like check in with him first to say like, hey, do you mind if I ask your friend some questions? It would be helpful. It was like he wasn't there. It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And it's like someone who just doesn't have step one of people can have these kinds of feelings, and they're still fully legitimate human beings that we can engage with. So that's a huge thing that's missing right now. I've had medical deans want to talk with me about medical students knowing suicide rates are high in that community. and wanting to do something about it. And I said, one thing that would be great is if you just had some successful doctors out there who struggle with suicidal thoughts and can just like talk about that and say like this can happen and you can normalize recovery and and they're like, well, we don't know anyone who fits that category. So something like Live Through This that just says like, here's 100 people from all sorts of backgrounds who all, you know, have dealt with this and are living their lives in various ways. And I don't know how we can amplify that more, but that's really badly needed in all spheres of society.
I have two thoughts. Well, three. Thank you. The second thought is suicide prevention loves to tell us not to normalize this experience, which I think is problematic. And, you know, we're just, I don't know, we're constantly shoving our heads up our own asses. And what was my third thought? I forgot it. Maybe I'll come back to it, but definitely go for that.
I feel like it's a great time to talk about psychiatry more in our beef corner.
Oh, in the beef corner specifically?
I think it's time for our beef corner. David, I don't know if you have a video for beef corner.
I didn't know you had a video.
Okay, here we go. It's going to be weird.
It just doesn't ever get old for me.
No, Doja Cat never gets old. This is so much better than the Tigers.
What? Okay. Now there are two beef.
Oh no! So we have some beefs that we agree a lot about, which I'm really excited about, David. So I know that you want to talk about prediction and we want to talk about psychiatry too. So talk to me about prediction.
Right. Well, yeah, we've covered some of psychiatry, so that's good. Obviously, it goes without saying, there's some really good psychiatrists out there, both in the science world and the practice world. But I would say the typical training psychiatrists get has very little on the scientific method, very little about critical thinking and the kinds of heuristics and biases that interfere with clinical judgment, and therefore very little training in how to have humility about the kinds of judgments and sort of treat all of your judgments that they might be wrong and you really need to see if you're on the right track. And yet they also get taught that they're the smartest person in the room at any given time by virtue of having an MD. So that's a very bad combination that causes problems. But you also ask about prediction. I don't know if this is, I know you didn't imply this. I'm thinking out loud. I don't know to what extent this is also a psychiatry issue or a broader issue. But there clearly is an obsession with prediction in the field of suicidology. And I think it's an unhealthy one, a misguided one, and is at the point now where it's really holding up progress. I get where it comes from. There's this feeling like at some level suicide is a decision. So if we just understand it well enough, we can get people to tell us when that's a decision they want to make and then stop them. Like, it just feels like we should be able to do that. And I think it's just wrong. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that's wrong. I think a lot of reasons why it's wrong is because even if we're going to talk to someone who's going to fully trust us and be fully honest with us, that's only one snapshot in time. I think a lot of people, when they make suicide attempts, were not planning, did not wake up that morning thinking they were going to attempt. Sometimes it does happen that way. But there's no way we're ever going to predict suicide with any kind of accuracy that will be clinically useful, except in the way that with heart disease, we'll broadly talk about, some people are at risk. You're at higher risk. You can get to there, and maybe we're already there. I don't know how much, fancy prediction methods are going to improve that. But we're not going to get better than that, in part because suicide is low base rate, so just statistically it's hard to predict, but in part because life is complex, it has moving parts, and that interfaces with this issue that people get confused about, that like simple theory can't interface with complex things. But here's a great example. I've never used this specific example before. I'm very excited. I have used the example of Newton's laws of motion to illustrate how something very simple and basic can handle complexity. Because I feel like in the suicide field, people would be like, what? All of motion, the whole world that's not at the speed of light or at the quantum level, is all explained or predicted by 3 laws of motion. You're crazy. Motion is complex and it's multi-determined, and what moves in different places and cultures with different temperatures and winds and forces and all different. You're insane to use 3 laws of motion. That's useful. And of course, they're not. 3 laws of motion are really useful. And under controlled conditions, we can predict, you can use them to predict really well, which is how we know that they're accurate. But here's where my new example comes into play. Here's a crumpled napkin. Can everyone at home see that? Using the incredible laws of motion, tell me where this napkin is going to be in 2 weeks. You can't. You have no idea. It could be in my office. It could be transported to some recycling bin or compost place. It could get lost outside and the wind can blow it somewhere. You have no idea. And it's not because the laws of motion are not accurate. Laws of motion tell us with very high precision what happens when forces act on this. But it's because there's so many damn forces in the world, we don't know which forces are going to act on this. And I think we can do the same thing. I think that should be our goal with suicide, is we can get to a point where we understand very well the conditions under which suicidal crises occur. We can understand why they happen. That is completely different from predicting with precision who will have the next suicidal crisis when. And that's because even if my theory is perfectly awesomely accurate, and we can explain all suicidal crises in terms of pain, hopelessness, connectedness, and capability, there are so many things that can cause pain, so many things that can impact hopelessness, so many things that can impact connection and capability, and there's too many things to keep track of. And so we'll never be able to use that information to predict. But it doesn't mean that when you have a theory of something that it's not useful. Once you understand the conditions under which something happens, or the conditions that bring something about, there are worlds of ways to intervene, to prevent, to improve people's lives. And I think that's what people are missing because they're getting obsessed with prediction. Can we get fancier computers and fancier algorithms? Of course, we also love brain scans, brain imaging. And we are getting occasional papers that I feel like are almost on a Saturday Night Live skit where you use machine learning algorithms to interpret brain scans. And it's how did that not solve suicide?
Can't believe.
Algorithms in the same paper.
Yeah, okay, so I also get caught up in the prediction thing. I have big beefs about prediction, sort of for different reasons, but sort of not. I think a ton of our obsession with prediction is about our belief that we have to intervene at the level that we think we have to intervene, and it's very caught up in coercion, right? So because we've taught ourselves or convinced ourselves as a field that our job is to prevent every suicide at all costs, and that it's us versus versus suicide, right? And the suicide is inside that person, right? So then we have it's us versus that person. It sets up this situation where if we don't predict it and stop it, then we failed. Instead of really thinking about suicide in a more broad way and talking about how do we make the lives of suicidal people better. And I think that's the big problem I have with prediction, is it's getting caught up in the wrong space, and giving yourselves as sort of people who work in this field, ourselves as people who work in this field, more power than we have any right to give ourselves. So and I think that touches on some of the same ideas, right? But it's on sort of more the practical application side instead of the theoretical side that sometimes we just think we are more powerful than we really are. Because the reality is all of our interventions that we use when we are trying to predict suicide don't work. People still die in the hospital. They die in jail. They die on their way to the hospital and on their way to jail and after they get out. And we don't have any control over that, really.
Yeah. I think fear is a big driver too. And who has power? We have a lot of loss survivors in the field, and obviously for reasons they want to save lives. I think what that results in sometimes is like Sam Dillon Finch said, is prolonging life rather than saving life. And it's completely misguided. So yeah, I wish we would worry about the part where we're interested in helping people find quality of life rather than prolonging and predicting.
It's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic about the three-step theory, because I feel like, I mean, we can choose many places to start to describe why intervention and treatment and prevention isn't so great. But I think one of them is that they almost always have to start with a diagnosis or something like that, which is, I think, not useful for a lot of reasons. It certainly ignores someone's context and environment, and a lot of people have like a really good reason to be miserable and resentful and upset and not have hope. And even for some people, though, I think a psychiatric diagnosis can be part of their story of pain and hopelessness and connectedness. I mean, they don't literally not exist. Those things do exist, and they can be part of someone's story. But even if you're starting there, you're just starting with some sort of, you're starting with something that's like off the mark. And to the extent that the three-step theory variables get at the core of the suicidal experience, I have this sort of fantasy that it can be used to have suicide-specific treatment approaches. Whether it's in a cognitive behavioral framework or an interpersonal framework or another framework, it can basically start with, if someone's feeling suicidal, and that's a big part of their life experience, then we need to understand their pain. Where's that coming from? What is it about? And there's a million different possible answers to that. Most of them are not, a diagnosis. We need to understand their hopelessness, both why they feel hopeless, what from their perspective, if it was change, would lead them to feel more hopeful, everything about that. We want to understand what do they value in life, both present and in the past, what do they feel connected to, what makes life worth living. And then you want to use that to determine the treatment plan, regardless of what approach you come from. And that could be both a suicide-specific treatment plan, but also a person-specific treatment plan, where the goals of reducing suicide risk and improving someone's life, reducing their pain, improving hope, and increasing their ability to engage with the connections that matter to them, those goals fit together. And that's one potential vision or hope that I have. It doesn't get into that huge philosophical existential question of who are we to decide that someone should be alive if they're feeling suicidal. I know, Jess, I heard you raise that, and that's a thorny one. I mean, like other people, I have some thoughts on that, but I wouldn't pretend to have it settled.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of people do pretend to have it settled, so I think that's interesting. I know I appreciate people like having some nuance around that. All right, speaking of beefs, I have a question. So you have been in some big debates, the Journal of Death Studies, and I'm interested if you're willing to talk about some of the differences and things that come up between your approaches and Heidi Hamlin's approaches and Anna Mueller's approaches to suicide research. Tell us about that. That's some big beefs.
As best as I can tell, this is my current best guess of what's happening. But I don't know for sure. I don't know that it's right, and I actually find it kind of confusing. But this is my best guess. I think that, because those folks come from the critical suicidology movement, and I think what's happening is they see the dominant approaches, which are psychiatrist, medical, and they're so wrong and so inadequate in so many ways. But they see that as synonymous with science and with quantitative measurement. And then they want to throw out the whole thing and replace it with a completely different approach. And whereas from my perspective, I think the scientific method and the medical establishment's approach to suicide are at major odds with each other. And I think getting rid of the medical approach is hugely important, but that science is the key, just like science is the key to really every other human challenge that's ever been faced, that we've been able to, any kind of advancement in health or technology or science comes through the scientific method. And the scientific method exists because people are so flawed. Because when we're left to our own devices, you look at the history of humanity, and we kind of just have wars with each other and genocide, and we have some of the stupidest beliefs in the world that are usually some version of I'm a god, or the person I worship is a god, or the person I follow has been still empowered by God, and everyone over there is wrong, and stars hang from the ceiling, and everything revolves around planet Earth. And when we leave the scientific method behind, we just come up with the stupidest things, and a lot of those stupid things end up hurting people. or we use it as justification. And the scientific method keeps us honest. It sucks so much because it's humans doing it, and we're constantly fooling ourselves. But the method is what keeps us honest. The method is what keeps us on the right track. I don't think it's coincidence that some may make the point that in the U.S. right now we have a current White House administration that is kind of waging a war on truth and kind of waging a war on democracy. And part of what they're doing is every scientific organization there is, they're trying to control them, muzzle them. And I think that's not a coincidence. I think science has often been humanity's best way to speak truth to power. Scientific method is what made it so that the church can no longer control knowledge and make claims about astronomy and things like that. Science is what made powerful people who believed in phrenology, it just exposed them, and you put it to the test and they're just wrong. One of the examples I use every year when I teach both undergrad and grad course is this book published around 1900 that had 300 case studies on phrenology and has a 3-part title. It was written by someone with a doctoral degree who was president of like an ethological society in London and was being lauded at all these academic venues a little over 100 years ago. And it was 300 case studies all demonstrating how white people's skulls signify superior intelligence and qualities compared to others. And it's the scientific method that says, listen, you tell me in advance how to measure skulls. You tell me in advance how you want me to measure intelligence. We'll do the study, and you demonstrate that you're just flat out wrong. So I just deeply believe in the scientific method as our path to truth. And I feel like the critical suicidology folks are sandwiching that with the medical model and want to throw both out. And I think that's where, in my opinion, that's where they're going wrong.
So, do you feel like qualitative methods are not scientific?
I think what I'm learning is people are using that term to mean different things. So Anna and I, from my perspective, and I think probably from hers too, very accidentally got in a terrible Twitter fight 6 months or a year ago, whenever it was. I felt like I was in the Twilight Zone. Like I just felt like we were talking past each other, and anyway, it was terrible. It made me decide to never get in a Twitter fight again because I apparently have no command over tone. I don't understand how the threads work, and anyway. But I ended up asking her back channel. I mean, Anna's so nice and so smart. I asked her back channel, could she send me an example of like some of her favorite qualitative work? And she sent me something, and I read it, and I mean, basically, it took a lot of narratives from people, but there was coding of inter-rater reliability to make sure independent raters were coding the same information, and then what their conclusions were based on percentages of which codes were like the most common. So I felt like it did a really nice job of using narrative data, being very descriptive. But in the end, to me, it was quantitative because those are my fears. My fears are that someone will collect a lot of like anecdotes, a lot of qualitative narratives, and then they'll just tell me what they think it means. And that I do not trust, whether it's me or someone else. I think humans have proven time and time again that we cannot be trusted in that regard. But when you have these safeguards built in, that you have inter-rater reliability to make sure someone else is coding things the same way I am, so like that's built in, and then what I'm reporting in order of importance corresponds to what ends up being in the data, then I start to feel like, oh, that's great. Like that's that has some of those safeguards built in, so we can't sort of run amok with our own perspective and biases.
Yeah, I think it's important that any science that we're doing also has strong connections to lived experience. And I think that's like your phrenology example is a great example of that, is that like science also can go very wrong when we are not when we like sort of assume science exists in a vacuum. And I think that it's important that people with lived experience of science is involved in our decisions about how to do scientific work. And I think that's some of the places where there becomes some rifts between the scientific community and the lived experience community, is because we have experienced science that was extremely harmful in a lot of different ways, right? Or this a process that was extremely harmful. So I think sometimes what comes up is that while someone might be doing like quantitative work, and the goal of that quantitative work is to capture lived experience and quantify it in a way that other people can understand it, the process of getting it doesn't feel to the people who are participating as if it honors and values their experiences, or they might not see themselves reflected in the results. And so I think there's just all of these little sort of nuances involved in how we make science good science that aren't just about scientific method, that are about, you know, the process, that are about valuing and centering people's experience of research and those kinds of things. So I think that a lot of the sort of debate that develops over time between lived experience communities and scientific communities is not so much about like whether or not science is good or whether or not doing research is good. It's about how people are treated in the process. And I think it's important to like remember those power dynamics as we're engaging in scientific work. And a lot of people don't do that very well.
No, I hear you. I think that makes perfect sense. And I feel like there's at least two things there. One is people doing good science, but not engaging a lived experience community in a meaningful way. I suspect, but then there's also, and I suspect this is more common, there's a lot of work that frankly is like scientistic, like looks really sciencey. The brain imaging stuff is a great example. There's so many damn brain imaging studies that NIH throws millions and millions and millions of dollars at. They violate basic standards of measurement and sample size. What we teach our first year students, you know, sample size large enough to have a reasonable estimate of what's going out there in the world, and minimum standards for measurement of reliability and validity. The fMRI world has just ignored those for years, decades at this point. And now they're finding that, lo and behold, all their stuff's not replicable. A big paper just came out the other day where they actually had brain scans from a few thousand people. So they were able to estimate what kinds of effect sizes are actually replicable and sample size these studies should have. It turns out these studies should be having hundreds, if not thousands of participants. And so it's just a bunch of noise that gets millions of dollars from NIH, that gets published in the absolute top psychiatry and psychology journals. Everyone gives awards for this work. And it's useless in that it violates minimum scientific standards, but then it also can be experienced in all the ways we're talking about as power to determine what's really important, disconnected from the realities of people with lived experience. And it's a big mess. I understand why people don't trust the establishment. I understand why science gets thrown in with medical model and the scientific method gets people, there's anger directed at it. And I don't know how to fix that. I don't know what to do. But it is my biggest fear. I think the scientific method is really the savior here, and it gets appropriated, it gets mangled, it gets, people wear lab coats and have clipboards and titles, and they sort of stand for science, and then they do bad things with people. And then it engenders anger in it and a big response, and people want to attack it. And I don't know how to fix that, but this is my best guess of what's happening, is that there's a lot of bad science out there by people with power who are not sufficiently empathic or engaged with the lived experience community. And all of it ends up being one big evil ball from the critical suicidology perspective.
Yeah, I would be really interested in having some discussion about that with people from the critical suicidology sort of camp on here, people who are more embedded in some of the research perspectives around it than I am, because I think they might have a different perspective about the way they're thinking about it, but I am not researchy enough to represent that, so I'm not going to try to. But I've really enjoyed having you on, and I want to make sure we have just a few minutes left. So I want to make sure that we have time for any kind of final thoughts that you want to have, any last points that you want to make while we've got 3 or 4 minutes left here.
Well, I do want to have a chance to say thank you for having me on and for facilitating these kinds of discussions in general. I think it's just really nice the work that both of you do. I also want to say hi to Naomi, who is in the feed and is a former undergraduate in my lab from back in the day.
Oh.
And it's actually the undergraduate who came up with the term ideation to action as like a term. when we were in the lab trying to figure out, like, it's like it's the smallest distinction. There's a million distinctions within ideation, a million distinctions within action, but even that one the field wasn't getting. Everyone's just like predicting attempts without it was just a mess. So we're like, we need a term. People respond to terms, and so Naomi came up with it. And I see her in the audience. Hey, Naomi. And also, she sent me something recently showing me that the three-step theory is being used by the Canadian correctional system as their model of suicide. Oh, hi. I don't have anything else immediately on my mind to make sure I say in our last 3 to 4 minutes.
All right. Des, do you have anything you want to wrap up with?
No, I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know.
I think my sort of final thought here is that, like, I do believe that there's quite a lot of people representing science, who represent science or the medical field, or those who get conflated, who are doing really bad things, and that cause a lot of problems, I think, between people with lived experience and the research community. And I think that research is really, really powerful when it is deeply connected with people with lived experience, and make sure that it honors them and preserves their dignity, and is including them in the work from the very beginning. So I'm excited that there are people that agree with that in the research community, because that's not always the case.
Well, I got a taste of that when I was in the psychiatric emergency room with my friend, and someone might want to argue like, oh, David's like a suicide researcher, he's part of the establishment. I was helpless. I was just watching the psychiatrist mistreat my friend and not have sufficient empathy, not treat him as a full human, and I just had to sit there and take it because I didn't want to antagonize him.
Yeah.
And so that's a small taste, that's, but it's there. I don't dispute for a minute that that's there. And yeah, I want to fix that too. And it's a big hill to climb.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for being here. This was awesome.
Thanks for having me. I hope I get to keep having conversations with you.
Yeah.
Nope, no more. It's over now.
I'm gonna do my first real curse word. I think I said damn twice, but I don't know if that counts.
You were so
excited
about being able to.
Can we just get like a good solid fucking?
Yeah. Do you want to just say a fuck at the end?
Gosh, do I have it in me?
I don't know. Do you want to try and shit, maybe?
Like I'm thinking about that psychiatrist who treated my friend poorly, but I'm like, I don't know. Maybe he meant well and is just like really, really ill-informed. Oh, maybe he'd feel bad if he knew how he came across.
Oh my god, I love it.
I got one for you. It still makes me feel awkward. Fuck at IMH for wasting millions and millions and millions of dollars on bad science that doesn't help people. There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect. I fully agree with that. What a
Very
wonderful
good. The end.
Grab, folks.
Yay. Just put the banner up because I forgot. We'll be back in like a week or something for the birthday.
September 3rd, we're going to do an anniversary episode. Just me and Des. Get ready.
Yep. Just yelling. I don't know.
Just usual.
Just the usual.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, David. It was good to have you.
Thank you.
Bye.